I haven't read it for a couple of years, but I used to read Bunyan's classic Pilgrim's Progress every few years. I mean, why wouldn't you? It's such a great, wonderful, descriptive book. And it describes wonderfully the Christian life. With his descriptive, poetic pen, as it were, Bunyan so helpfully named all the characters in the book, didn't he? I mean, it's the story of Christian, and we have people like faithful and hopeful and talkative in the book. I mean, it's a wonderful and wonderfully descriptive read. I wonder, how would you describe your Christian journey? How would you describe yourself? Would you be one of those names that Bunyan so helpfully used? Or would it be different names at different times? I'm going to ask you a question tonight. Were you expecting the Christian life, or are you still expecting the Christian life to be a life of bliss and blessing? Was that your expectation? Is it still your expectation? Just bliss and blessing? Well, as we've seen these past few weeks, the life of Abraham is one that is repeated so often in so many ways in our lives. It's a type, if you like, of journey by most Christians. It's never plain sailing, is it? It's never easy. You look at the life of Abraham and you say it's definitely not bliss and blessings. It's testing, it's temptation, it's slow growth. Abraham's journey of faith is like that. So why should you and why should I expect our Christian journeys to be any different? Never in the Bible do we see, even in the New Testament, those followers of Jesus have a life that is just bliss and blessing. Rather, we see persecution and troubles and difficulties. And it's no different in the life of Abraham. He's known, isn't he, as the father of faith. He is presented to us as this great man of faith. He is the man of faith in many ways in the Old Testament. He's the pagan who God comes to and speaks to and commands to move countries and to go to a place where God is going to show him, to go to another land. And Abraham's faith, straight away in his story, is seen in his obedient action. That faith and his action, his obedient action, of course, going together. Faith and action always go together. That's why the book of James is written. Show me your faith. Your faith should be seen. There's a challenge for us straight away this evening. Is your faith seen by others? When other people think of you and describe you, would faith be one of the words that they use to describe you? Would your actions show? You know, in the book of Acts we were thinking of last year, we were studying through the book of Acts, and when you think of Stephen, they were choosing deacons, and Stephen was chosen because he was a man full of faith. And then there's just a description of what Stephen's like, and it's clear that people could see what he was like. By the way that he lived, his full of faith life was seen by others. It impacted others. Is yours seen? Abraham's is seen, isn't it? He moves countries. He goes where God tells him to go. But the next thing we see is that he fails the test of faith. So we have success, he moves. But then the next thing we read in his life is that he fails the test of faith in Egypt when he pretends that Sarah is not his wife. He doesn't have enough faith in the protection of God. But then he has enough faith to offer his nephew Lot the first choice of the best land in Canaan. So then his faith in God is enough for that situation. Then he has enough faith to rescue Lot from the attacking kings. He has enough faith to bless King Melchizedek, the mysterious priest of God. He has enough faith to believe then, to believe God, when the Lord confirms that even in his old age, he'll have a son. But then he doesn't have enough faith to withstand Sarah's plan to have a child for Abraham via the womb of Hagar. In his great faith, he should have stood up against that plan, but he didn't. He caved in. And he marries Hagar and has Ishmael as a result. But then he has enough faith to listen to God and be circumcised in his old age and circumcise his family and household. He has enough faith to eat with the Lord and with the two angels, and then pleads to the Lord about Sodom and Gomorrah for the honor of God's name. And he pleads and pleads and pleads in faith. Abraham has enough faith to stay for many years well away from Sodom and Gomorrah. But Abraham doesn't have enough faith when he goes to the Negev and he meets Abimelech. He doesn't have enough faith. And again pretends that Sarah is not his wife, even in his old age. Well, it's all been building to what we saw last week. Because Abraham eventually has enough faith to listen to God and send Hagar and Ishmael away. And then the ultimate test of faith came, as we saw. And it's been building to this. When God commands Abraham to sacrifice his only son, your chosen son, Isaac. And again, his faith is seen in his obedience and his deep-rooted trust that God has told me to do this, and his belief in the promises of God taking root so deep in him that he believes that God will bring back Isaac from the dead. He knew that God would keep his promises. Truly, Abraham is a man of faith. But his journey of faith is not a kind of a straight line on the graph. There are blips along the way. And your life of faith and my life of faith is like that as well. The question is the graph moving in the right direction? It may be slowly. But is it going in the right direction? Is your faith deepening? It may be that the big test for you will come in old age, as it came for Abraham. And now, on the back of that ultimate test, we now have a very sad chapter because it's the death of Sarah. She dies at 127. She dies in Hebron, in Canaan. And we see straight away in verse 2 that as she dies, that Abraham is grief-stricken. He mourns for Sarah. He weeps over her. It's his wife for so many years. He has loved her. And now she has passed. It's the reminder that death is the last enemy and the greatest enemy. That death separates. That there is a reality to death. That when people die, we miss them terribly. And Abraham and Sarah is no different. This man with such great faith in the living God, with great faith, as we'll see, in the promises of God, but he still misses Sarah. Of course he does. He's not alone in that, is he? The Lord Jesus, his response when he is told about Lazarus dying, he wept. He was grieved on occasions. When he sees the widow in Nain burying her son, Jesus sees her and has compassion for her. He is someone who pities with us. He has known what it is to grieve for loved ones. It's clear from his absence from the Word of God that at some point Joseph has died, Jesus' father. He knows what it is to grieve. He knows what you go through when you mourn. And he knows what Abraham is going through here. And so Abraham mourns and weeps, and then he speaks to the Hittites. Sell me some of your property, some land for a burial site. Just as the Philistines had done with Abimelech earlier, they recognize that Abraham is a special man. When they call him and they say to him in verse 6, you are a mighty prince among us, they're basically saying you're a prince of God. That's the inference of what they're saying. They know that this is a man of the living God. They can tell it. They know he's different. And so they offer him a tomb anywhere. They're blessing him. They're honoring him. But Abraham wants a particular site. He has a particular site in mind, and so he asks them to speak to Ephron on his behalf and kind of begin the negotiations on his behalf to buy the necessary land. He uses these Hittites as kind of the estate agent. And so, as the offer is made, Ephron agrees that Ab could have the land for free. You can have it. You're Abraham. Have it and bury your dead. But Abraham wants to buy the land and eventually pays a good, if somewhat inflated, it seems, overpriced payment for the land. And so he buys the land and he buries Sarah there. The land, the field, and the cave that comes with it is now legally, as we saw, end of verse 17, was legally made over to Abraham as his property. Then in verse 20, so the field and the cave in it were legally made over to Abraham by the Hittites as a burial site. Now, why is this important? Why does Abraham not just take the land that's offered to him? Well, of course, Abraham has no land of his own. That's why he's asking for a burial site. But if he's given land, then it's not legally his. So as we see from verses 17 to 20, the point is because he buys it, it's now legally made over to his. He owns the land, there can be no dispute. The contract, as it were, is binding. It's now his. Again, why is that important? Well, he's in his old age, isn't he? And as we'll see in a moment, we're still looking at the covenant being fulfilled by the living God. Remember that God has called him from Ur of the Chaldees, go to a land that I will give you. And he has basically lived and traveled around in his tent. He's never put down any roots. God has promised him this land, but for Abraham, and it is for his descendants as well, but Abraham personally has never owned any of this land that God has promised him. And so the argument could be made, did God really fulfill the covenant in Abraham's lifetime? In chapter 23, we see the last little pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, that is the covenant that God's made being put in place. In this fullness of time, God's covenant here is just being fulfilled piece by piece. Well, Abraham has just faced the greatest test of his life, hasn't he, on Moriah, as he's taken Isaac up. He's faced that test, and as he's come down the mountain now, we don't know the time scale here, but now the next thing we read is of Sarah dying. It's another testing time for Abraham. And Sarah's importance, the beloved wife of Abraham, should not be understated here. This is written for us to show us how important Sarah is. Because we see that in the way that it's written. Sarah is the only woman in the Bible whose age is given at her death. Verse 1, Sarah lived to be 127 years old. Now, through the book of Genesis, that's not unusual. Noah lived 2, Enoch lived. We're given how long they lived. But no women. Sarah is the only woman in the Bible whose age is given. It's marking her out as being significant. And it never happens again. Additionally, Sarah is the first recorded burial in the Bible. All those who had died before, we don't read of their funerals or their burials or anything else. Sarah's the first burial that we read of. Not only that, the negotiation for the burial plot is the first recorded commercial transaction in the Bible. And so this chapter really is a chapter of firsts. And it's to underline the importance of Sarah, a woman, in Bible times. But you see, God is underlying the importance of this woman here in the redemptive purposes and the redemption story of God. Sarah is a key component with Abraham in this. And that's really chapter 23. So I just want to pick up really on two things in this chapter for us this evening. And the first thing that I want us to kind of home in on is this. God's plan provides. God's plan provides. And we didn't read it, but you see it at the end of chapter 22. God is Jehovah Jireh. He is the Lord who provides. And in God's great plan, he provides. He does. At the end of chapter 22, you may remember that Prussell Jones read for us last week. I didn't get him to read the last verses of chapter 22 because there are some particularly difficult names in those few words. And I wasn't particularly homing in there. But Abraham is told that Milcah, also a mother, born sons to your brother Nahor, Uz the firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel, etc., etc. Here's the important bit, verse 23. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah, and then there's 8 sons, and so there's a family line. And it almost seems kind of inconsequential and insignificant, and what's it doing there? Abraham's relatives have more children. There's a bigger, wider family over there somewhere, not even close to where Abraham's living. So what, you may say. But you see, God's plan provides. God's, not his plans, his plan. His plan. It provides. And here, those just few verses will become very important, God willing, next Sunday night when we look at chapter 24. Because remember that Abraham is going to be the father of a nation. He's going to have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, sand on the seashore. He's got a child, Isaac. He's the promised child. He's got one. How on earth is he going to have number to like the grains of sand? Well, Isaac's going to have lots of children. Well, he's not going to do that on his own, is he? He needs a wife. So where's he going to get a wife from? It's not to be one from Canaan. It's to be a relative of Abraham. It's to be from the same wider family. And so those few verses, sandwiched in between the immensely important testing of Abraham's faith on Mount Moriah, and then the death of Sarah. These just few little verses seem inconsequential, but they're part of God's plan as he provides for his people. His plans need his provision. For those plans of God to come into force, to be enacted, God has got to provide the right people at the right time, and that's what he does here in the fullness of time. You see, God's plans are not reactionary. In his world, don't think that because you do something, well, God will overrule that and then decide to do this instead. Well, God was going to do this in the world, but because you did that and somebody else did that, God's now going to do something else. God's not reactionary. His plan is not reactionary in that way. God's plans are not just at the right time, this happens, as if it happened at a different time, it wouldn't happen. That's not what we read in the Bible. It's not just at the right time, it's in the fullness of time. And there is a very subtle difference between the two. Because just at the right time implies that someone is not in control and has limited control and can't affect this, that, or the other, but is just waiting to act and then does something. In the fullness of time. That shows that God's plans are all encompassing. And that God's plans involve just everything. He knows. You see, God is outside of time, isn't he? He is the one who created time. And in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. You see, God fulfills. God does not change his plans because of your decisions. I can play chess in that I know where the pieces move and how to move them, and I can start a game and I know when I've lost and I know when I've won occasionally. And I understand that the way to play chess is to plan some moves ahead, to react to your opponent, but try and as well move your opponent around, so trying to change what he does by what you do. Chess is one of those games, though, isn't it, that if you come up to an opponent who is only slightly better than you, it's one of those games where you always lose, just about. Because that person is superior, has superior wisdom and tactical nous and ability, then they always beat you. You know, you can play some other sports and, you know, you may lose 8 times out of 10, but there's those 2 times when you do win. It may be a lucky fluke or whatever. But it's not like that. There's no lucky bounce of the ball in chess. The person who's better than you will just beat you. Imagine if I played a grandmaster, it wouldn't last long, would it? Because grandmasters at chess have plans for every occasion and can switch plans and can manipulate their plans and can manipulate you into their plans and draw you into their traps easy, so that you are playing the game on their terms. You're dancing to their tune. Yeah, you can move around and everything else, but eventually their plans come to pass. That's, though, not like God. God is not a grand kind of chess grandmaster. God is playing all the pieces on the board. All of them. There is nothing outside of his will. His plans don't change because of what you do, because of your decisions, because of your sin, because you haven't done what he's called you to do, or you are doing what he hasn't called you to do. His plans are yes and amen, because God is omnipotent and omniscient. In easier words, smaller words, God knows everything and can do anything and everything. And so he doesn't need to change his plans. Because whatever you and I do, God knows. Because he's outside of time. And he has that wisdom and knowledge to know the end from the beginning. God works all things. Works all things. All things are in his plan. And so, Abraham, the plans here are not reactionary. God has planned here and reveals to us. These people over here, your brother Nahor, we haven't heard about him since the beginning of the story of Abraham. Suddenly appears, well, God's still working over there with Nahor, because later on, well, there's got to be Rebekah. That's what God does in his grace. And you see here now Abraham buying land. He's buying the land here, and it's for him, it's a grave for him and for Sarah and his descendants. The land, the purchase of the land, is almost like the last piece of the covenant promises coming into play. Really, after the death of Abraham, the only thing that hasn't been fulfilled is the seed. The promised seed. Yeah, the child has been born, the child of promise, but the child, the seed of Abraham, who is Christ. He's the only piece of the jigsaw that hasn't actually been put in place at that time. I'll make you into a great nation and bless you. I'll make your name great and you will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That's the seed. But apart from that, go to the land I'll show you. You're going to have the land. And as Abraham now purchases the land, this is the last bit, as it were, in Abraham's life that's important. Though, of course, Isaac marrying Rebekah and having children is equally as important, as we'll see next week. But you see, the covenant promises of God, those promises of God are falling into place one by one, bit by bit, all coming. The plan is coming together. The plan is being revealed. The plan is being seen. God is providing for Abraham. He's providing a daughter-in-law. He's providing land legally owned. The covenant plans of God provide so much. His plans are there. You know, has God ever let you down? Perhaps you feel that he has. His ways and his thoughts are not our ways and our thoughts. He is omnipotent. He is omniscient. He has the ability and the power to do anything and everything. But he knows everything as well. You know, our thoughts and our ways are different because we have such limited knowledge. I don't know what's going on anywhere else in the world at the moment apart from what's going on here now. And neither do you. But God does. He knows what's going on in every part of the world, in every moment, in every household, in every part of human history. God knows it all. And he knows what's going to happen next week and tomorrow and in 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 years or whenever. And so you may feel that God has let you down, but he knows best. And he is gracious, and God has a plan that provides. He has provided much grace to you. He knows everything. And time is so important to us. We're bound by time, aren't we? But in a sense, time is irrelevant to God. And things that are kind of prescient and so important to us now, God outside of time, knowing the future, knowing the past, time is not something that constricts him. And so in God's great plan of salvation, God has provided, hasn't he? We saw that last week. He provides the lamb, the substitute, for Isaac. God has provided the substitute for our sins to be the sin bearer. Christ has come and Christ has died. And he has taken the punishment. That is God's provision for us. Well, the second thing that I want us to see is this. People of faith look forward to better promises. People of faith look forward to better promises. Do you see what Abraham has done here? He is, as a man of faith, looking forward. He's not looking back, he's looking forward. If Abraham was looking back, well, he would have buried Sarah back where they were from. That's tradition, still tradition today. You often get buried where your family are from. That's very common. But Abraham doesn't. Abraham is looking forward. Abraham buries Sarah in the promised land, knowing that in that burial site, in that field that he now legally owns, that he will be buried there as well. He purchases the land. Why did he own no land? Because God had taken him from another place. But he's now in the promised land, and he's looking forward. He's not looking backwards to Ur of the Chaldees. And in fact, his descendants being buried there, because it's not just Sarah, but Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob are buried there as well. They are pointing forward for us. towards something else. Not the physical Middle East promised land, but they are pointing forward to a better promised land, built on better eternal promises, on heavenly ones, a heavenly city. Now, why can I say that? Because of Hebrews 11. If you've got a Bible with you, it's worth turning to Hebrews chapter 11. Because when the writer to the Hebrews starts his treatise, or his people of faith, he starts off by describing what the people are like. Verse 13 of Hebrews 11, all these people, he's talking about people of faith, and he's talking about Abraham. He's already talked about Abraham and Isaac. Well, even before that, verse 8, by faith Abraham, when called to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. It's their land that's been promised, but they're still in tents. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was unable to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he was as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. You see what the writer to the Hebrews is saying here? They are looking forward in the promises of God, not just to an earthly place. I mean, they live in tents. But they're looking forward to better promises, to the fulfillment of the promise, which is the city of God, which is a heavenly home. That's the object that they are looking forward to. That's where their faith is sending them to. They're not looking back. They're looking forward. They're looking forward to better promises. Yeah, the land is a great promise. He's got a cave and a field. It's great. Better to own some land than none. But it is nothing, is it, compared to the heavenly land, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to a heavenly home, to the mansion that has been prepared for them. You see, people of faith are always looking forward to eternity. We see that with Jesus, don't we? He's always looking forward. In Hebrews 12, we're told, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. What does he do? For the joy was set before him, he endured the shame, scorning the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For the joy set before him. Eternity before him. In faith, Jesus, the Son of God, is looking forward. If Jesus is looking forward to those better promises, those better days, that better joy, then we need to look forward to that day as well. See, people of faith look forward. You see it if you ever read missionary biographies from previous years. Today it is slightly different, isn't it, in the world, in that if you go somewhere to be a missionary because of world travel and communications and the rest, well, you can keep in contact with your family and you can travel home far easier. But go back 50 years, and when people left to be missionaries, the expectation was family wouldn't see them again. What were they doing? Why were they going? Why did Hudson Taylor go to China? Because he realized his citizenship was not in China or in England or Britain, but it's in heaven. And he's looking forward to a better promise of a better place. People of faith look forward to those better promises. That's what Abraham is doing as he buys the field. That's what this chapter is really all about, as Hebrews 11 indicates. You know, people who look back all the time, you know them, they're always looking back. But when you walk and look back all the time, then you stumble and fall over. If you're driving in the car and looking back in the rearview mirror, then you're going to crash very quickly. And Christians who look back all the time are going to stumble and fall and crash. Philippians 3, forgetting those things that are behind. Now, there is a sense in which you've got to remember, you've got to have a glance in the mirror. You've got to know what's behind you to be able to forget it. And we are to count our blessings, name them one by one. That's the hymn writer is right. But Paul's advice in Philippians 3 is to press on towards the goal. Abraham is pressing on towards a better promise. Those missionaries are pressing on. Jesus endures the cross. Why? He's thinking of the joy that is set before him. We've got to stop living as followers of Jesus Christ as if this world is all there is, as if this world is of ultimate importance. We are not to look to a country of our own. We should be longing for a better country, a heavenly one, because our citizenship is not in West Wales or Britain or the European Union or Europe or anywhere else. Our citizenship is in a far better place, in a heavenly city, which is far, far better. We must make much more of the resurrection to come. Yes, Abraham mourned and grieved the loss of Sarah. He did, and of course we should. But we don't grieve as those with no hope. Abraham grieved and then was building towards a better city, a resurrection life. He'd already believed that Isaac would live again. And it's clear he knew the day of the city of God. He's looking forward to it. Are you someone of faith? Are you looking forward to those better promises? Bliss and blessings are Abraham's experience now, but they weren't when he was on earth. The Christian life of bliss and blessing has been promised by God, but not today, but in that future that God has for us, that resurrection life. That is where bliss and blessings abound, with no sadness and no sorrow and no death. Just joy in the presence of our great Saviour God. Well, what a life of faith it was for Abraham. It's not straightforward. He does grieve, but he's looking to a better promise. Is that you tonight? You looking to better promises? Look to all that Jesus has secured on the cross. Look to them and keep them in front of you, stirring you on as you keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. Look forward to that better city, that better country that he has promised.